Hey guys! So tonight we're going to learn about ancient Egypt as it relates to the government and social structures for our political unit. As we go through the slides, there's going to be a couple that will say like turn and talk because we were supposed to do these in class, but since we're doing the Olympics, I wanted to make sure that you still got the notes, but it didn't make us too behind. So instead of obviously turning and talking to your neighbor or your group members, just answer the question and we'll kind of go back to the turn and talk part next week. All right, so first, in ancient Egypt, they had a strong central government that held absolute power. Religion and government were inseparable, and Egyptian government was based around a social structure, and they thrived due to a large workforce. So on here, you had the social structure that was in Egypt. So obviously, the very bottom was you had the most people, but you were at the very bottom of society. Whereas at the top, it had the least amount of people, but you were the best, considered the best in that society. So at the bottom, you have farmers and slaves. Then you have craftsmen, merchants, scribes, soldiers, and then government officials, nobles, and priests. And then at the very top, of course, you have your pharaoh. The pharaoh held absolute authority over Upper and Lower Egypt. Men and women have both held this position, which you learned about today, or well, you learned about it yesterday. Men and women have both held this position. The pharaoh owned all the land, made laws, collected taxes, and defended Egypt against outside threats. The pharaoh is considered divine ruler, which is the high priest of every temple. He or she represented the gods on earth. He or she was in charge of major building projects such as temples and pyramids. And one of the pharaoh's duties was to care for the citizens of Egypt, like just making sure everybody was well fed. So as you can see, here's one of those turn and talk things, questions. How does the Egyptian pharaoh compare to the leader of your country? So that would be here in the U.S. So compare a pharaoh to the president. And then just some fun facts. The youngest pharaoh to rule was King Tut, who came to power after the death of his father, and he was only 9 years old, which is the same age as a third grader, which some of you may have third grade younger siblings. So imagine your little brother or sister being in charge of a whole place and ruling everybody. He had a very mysterious death at the age of only 18 years old. Many people think he was murdered, and he's so famous today due to the discovery of his tomb because he is one of the only pharaohs that his mummy was found along with all of his stuff. That is definitely not the case for every discovery, if there even is a discovery on other pharaohs. So because he had both, we found both the mummy and all of his stuff made him so famous. Again, the question: how would you handle being in power at only 9 years old? Thinking of myself when I was 9, I don't think I would be a hot mess. Everybody probably be like eating candy and listening to NSYNC, and that just probably would not be good for my people. Government officials, nobles, and priests. The vizier is the highest government official. His authority falls just below the pharaoh. He was often a member of the pharaoh's family, and some of his duties include appointing government officials, dealing with legal matters, controlling food supply, recording water levels of the Nile, and collecting taxes. The nobles and priests fell below the pharaoh and the vizier and still held high positions in the overall government structure. And their main duty was to oversee scribes and merchants. They ensured daily operations ran smoothly. Then you have your soldiers. The landscape and natural barriers served as a great protection for Egyptians, but there came a time when an actual army was needed. Remember, we talked about how the Nile, the Mediterranean Sea, and the Sahara Desert were those natural barriers that helped protect Egypt. But if they did need soldiers' duty was to protect the region from invaders, obviously, and they primarily used a bow and arrow, but they also relied on short swords, spears, and axes. They also depended on chariots and armor during the time of war. And then if you see over to the left, it's the Eye of Horus, which is a symbol of protection in ancient Egypt. Then you have your scribes, which a scribe is a person, typically a man, who has the privilege of learning to read and write. Their writing took the form of hieroglyphics and scripts. It was very complicated to read. Individuals had to spend 4 to 5 years attending a special school and practice on papyrus. So kind of think of it as if like they had to go off to college to do what they're supposed to be doing. And their duties included recording daily happenings and completing trade transactions and writing letters. Here's another question for you to answer. How would life be different if you weren't able to read and write? Then you have your merchants. Merchants brought items into market to sell. They played a significant role in trade, and some of the goods they sold were papyrus, pottery, gold, and jewelry. Next, you have your craftsmen. The craftsmen were highly trained laborers. They created objects for the pharaoh in the temples and palace workshops. Objects created for ordinary people were made in small workshops. They were very well respected, and they included a variety of artists such as sculptors, painters, metalworkers, stone cutters, and architects. And then you had your farmers and slaves. The farmers and slaves were considered peasants and were the lowest ranked class. The majority of the Egyptian population were part of this social class. Thanks to the fertile soil provided by the Nile River, farmers were able to grow an abundance of crops, including barley, wheat, vegetables, and a variety of fruit. And although slaves had less opportunities than other class members, they could own land, and they were and were not considered fully owned by another person. All right, so that's it for your flip notes on the Egyptian government. But like I said, make sure, even though you're not actually turning and talking to your neighbor, you can turn and talk to your sibling, your parents, your dog, FaceTime a friend. But make sure you answer those questions so that we can do the turn and talk next week when we get back to social studies after the Olympics. All right, have a good weekend.